Welcome to what we think is going to be the first episode of Mindful Masculinity's podcast. We're experimenting with a talk show format that accompanies the Substack, but might stand alone on its own. My name is Richard D'Ambrosio. I'm the author, I guess, of the Mindful Masculinity Substack. Today, I've asked Bill McGee to join me. Bill is an author, an aviation writer. He is currently senior fellow for aviation and travel at the American Economic Liberties Project. So he's down in DC a lot, lobbying to keep the skies safer for you and I. Bill holds his MFA from Columbia University, and he has used it in part as the author of two books. One of them is about the airline industry. It was an expose on sort of the craziness that can go on in aviation. It's called Attention, All Passengers. But he also wrote a novel to some degree about masculinity and fatherhood called Half the Child. So, Bill, thanks for taking time out to talk a little bit about your experience as a man in today's environment, certainly in the publishing industry. We'll be getting to that. But, just off the top, masculinity and the crisis that supposedly is always surrounding us is quite a popular discussion. We, 2 years ago, we had Christine Emba write a Washington Post op-ed, and it got tons of attention. She actually did a video following it. Richard Reeves published his book Of Boys and Men and then launched the American Institute for Boys and Men. I think I just saw him the other night on The Daily Show. Ruth Whitman just published a book last year, the Boy Mom book, where again, the same theme runs through all three of these individuals and just about, it seems, everywhere else in public media today. Men are lost, men are in crisis. And I want to hear from you, does that perception seem right to you? Do you challenge the concept that so many of these very popular writers and ostensibly advocates for men that they're promoting?
Yeah, I think there's no question. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here, Rich. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank
I've
you.
been looking forward to this for 2 weeks now. And as you say, it's kind of scary when we think how far back we go, when we were both toiling as ink-stained wretches in the aviation industry, writing about airlines and going to the same press conferences, and I think having a few drinks afterwards, if I'm not mistaken.
Quite a masculine world.
Yes, absolutely. And it's funny you mention it because it permeates all different areas of our lives. There were one or two female reporters back then, and I remember
Asra Nomani at the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the trades that we wrote for, I remember a few, and I was close to a few. And, it was the old syndrome, the Jackie Robinson syndrome, that, it wasn't enough to be as good. You had to be better, I think was what drove a lot of them, in a field like that, because aviation, particularly at that time, it's still residuals in the industry, obviously. But at that time, and I worked in the airlines in the 80s and 90s, it was so testosterone driven. I mean, it was just, I worked for some airlines, and I'm going to be very honest with you about this. I look back and I have a little bit amount of shame that I didn't speak up more. I knew certain things were wrong. I didn't participate, but the way that, in particular, when I think of one airline where I worked at, the way the female flight attendants were treated, it was despicable. And it was just, and it, I mean, in the worst case scenario, sometimes it became physical, but just the verbal stuff all the time, the commenting about their appearance and their bodies and all the rest of it. And, I look back and I was a kid, I was in my 20s, and not that that's an excuse, but I hadn't yet developed a skill set to say, hey guys, enough, like, just knock it off. I was not happy about it, but, and then from the airlines, I went and became, a journalist, as you were, and covering the airline industry. And it was still that testosterone. There was still that, that type of thing going on. I mean, I'm going to be very upfront. I mean, I'm looking forward to this conversation, but I just want to say for the record, what a shame that we even have to have it, to be talking about these issues. To me, it's like, we could be putting that energy into doing so many other productive things. And we're
Yep.
still talking about gender stuff on both sides. And we still
Yeah.
have, there's so many knee-jerk reactions on both sides. I mean, I know you very well. I know what a good man you are. And I know that both of us are, you know, pro-woman. We are feminists. We have, done all we can for the women in our lives to help them do better. I want to see everybody do well, but there's this zero-sum game mentality that just permeates as if only
Absolutely.
one side, that it's a teeter-totter,
Yeah.
oh, women are up, so men have to be down. Can't we all rise together, And I mean, I know you've heard it, you've written about it, I've read your work, and it's so terrific. But the idea that, like, when you talk about just even bringing up the subject, say, well, yeah, straight white men are having a crisis, you immediately, the comments underneath that are, well, boo
People
freaking
freak
who,
out.
right? Oh, too bad you ran the world for 5,000 years. I get it. I get it. And there are some straight white men in this country right now who are doing things to the nation that we love that I think are horrifying, and millions of us. Um, but that doesn't mean that there aren't problems. And so it's funny, when I was thinking today about what we would be talking about tonight, I was thinking about how my worlds, which are often separate, sometimes they collide. And I'll just give you one example. I've been very outspoken as an aviation journalist and as an advocate about the practice of U.S. airlines outsourcing their maintenance. Okay. And
Right.
so most Americans that get on airplanes don't realize that every airline in the United States today in 2025 sends what they call the heavy maintenance. They send their aircraft to El Salvador, China, Singapore, Brazil, Mexico, right? Now, I'm not turning this into an airline forum, but what that meant is, I mean, I look at it as a safety issue, but think about it as a jobs issue. For decades, for basically the better part of a century, the United States was the gold standard in aviation. We invented the airplane, we invented the airline. I mean, all of these achievements, they were done in part because of a really proud and skilled workforce, overwhelmingly men,
Yeah.
and most of them at the big airlines certainly were unionized, and they had good jobs, and they
Yeah.
bought good homes. And in some cases, I've spoken to many, many airline mechanics who are second and third generation. Well, guess
How
what?
many how many Nassau County households
Oh, sure.
probably were headed up by a guy who drove to JFK overnight
Right.
and was replacing parts, getting planes ready for the morning.
Working in Pan Am Hangar
And
17. I mean, I
yep.
can tell you exactly where they were. And
Yeah.
and all over the country like that. In San
Yeah.
Francisco for United, and and Oklahoma for American, et cetera.
Right.
And so that field has been decimated. And I have spoken to multiple mechanics who have said to me, you know, my son, my daughter just, got out of the service, got out of college, got out of this. And I told them, don't do this. Don't enter this. Now, how sad is that? That's such a proud and, excuse me,
Yeah.
extremely skilled profession. Okay.
Yes. To keep a ship that
Especially these things, yeah, to
large in the
try
air.
and keep up with, the technology in avionics. And
Yeah.
so, what happens to all those people, right? I mean, we
Right.
make these decisions because, and if you want to get political, then look, let's just say it right up front. It's both parties. They both have a
Absolutely.
lot of blame
Yep.
here for shipping good jobs, whether it's NAFTA, whether it's across the Pacific, wherever, Europe, for shipping all those good jobs to China and the rest of it. And so here's just a very simple question. So you have someone who is not maybe ready to retire. They're halfway through a skilled career, a good paying career. And now you're told, well, your job just went to El Salvador, to
Right.
someone who's making pennies on the dollar for what you made, right?
Right.
So it's bad for the safety of the aircraft on the one hand, but what are we supposed to do with those men? Where are they supposed to go? And and then you times that times all the factories that have shut down and all of the other, skilled and in some cases unskilled labor that has simply gone away. Um, you
I
know,
was
there were
I was
people telling us that
online.
we're all going to be writing code, right? Well, we're not all doing that, right? What are they supposed to do to make a living?
I was online doing some research for another Substack, and I came across a EPI analysis. It was done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they were looking at American productivity and hourly compensation. And up until 1973, productivity was from 1948, it was up about 96.7%. and hourly compensation was up 91.3%. From 1973 to 2013, productivity leaped by almost 75%. Hourly compensation went up 9.2%.
Right.
That's 12 years ago. But it's a perfect example to what you just said is that companies are getting the benefit of hard work. The companies are getting the productivity. The airlines are getting the productivity of having planes that are flying as many hours as they can get out of them a day. But the cost, the hourly compensation to keep those planes safe and in the air, the American male, who made up a big part of that workforce, is getting
Right.
none of the benefit. You're
No,
right.
and
It is a
yeah,
trend across so many industries. Yeah.
and then you look at, you look at education levels, I mean, look, we get it that there was a time when virtually, nearly all, not all, but nearly all college graduates were men, and certainly, in postgraduate degrees and all the rest of it. But, then it started evening out a couple of decades ago. And now, and I saw this with my own eyes because I taught for 10 years at a university on Long Island. And each year, more and more female students, I almost said passengers. Wow. Okay, there's my worlds colliding. Sorry. Female students and fewer male students, right? And then that is borne out by the statistics, as you well know, which you're quoting all the time. So why is it that we can't have this conversation? Why does it have to be a third rail? To just say, hey, look, think about boys, forget grown men. Think about boys. Think about boys being told, girls rule and boys drool. Think, why can't we talk about this? I can hear people right now screaming as I'm saying this, saying, what about all the abuse that men do? We get it, but not all men are jerks.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many men I have mentored at companies like American Express, where I worked, guys who I'm still friends with today on social media, and I can see how much time they're investing in their kids. Unless they're faking it, how much they clearly love and respect their wife, who is not a stay at home mom, how much they are spending time, taking care of those household chores, but you never really hear that message coming through as a generalization or stereotype about men. It's always they don't like to do chores and they put too much work on women. It's always, this somewhat statistically backed, but frankly, overblown perception that men drool.
Yeah, well, I mean, and so here's the thing. Look at fatherhood, okay, which is close to my heart and close to your heart, and we know
Yes,
both, we're close enough friends that we know how important that is to us.
absolutely.
For me, you almost sound like a really cheesy politician or some CEO of a company who's been fired for doing something awful when they say, I want to spend more time with my family, right? Well,
It's
you and I are men that really do want to spend more time with our family, right? So
I still got one
it's
living
become a
with me.
cliche. Right, right, exactly. And I'm ready to do anything to see my son anytime, and even though he's an adult, it's like it's still the love of my life. But think about that. Think about the fact that in our lifetime, basically, we're about the same age. Fathers were different 40 or 50 years ago, in America. I can't speak to the rest of the world. I can speak to American culture. And that, Don Draper Mad Men syndrome of, the mom ran the house. I mean, part of it was economics too, right? Because in those days you could have a one income household, right? And
Yep.
fathers did not know their in large measure. I do not want to paint with a wide brush. And of course, there were always been dedicated, caring fathers that know everything about the kids. But it was not uncommon in those days for fathers not to know their kid's teacher's name or the name of their stuffed animal, whatever it was, and they didn't, always do the bedtime reading and all the rest. But we have seen a transformation. To me, it is a societal transformation that is really, really incredible what has happened in the last 40, 50 years, because you and I are now not anomalies being such devoted fathers. We
No,
are pretty much, and it crosses all divides, economic and racial and everything else, religious. And so why, if fatherhood in the United States has been so transformed in the last 50 years, why is that not reflected in the culture more, in movies, in TV, in
I
advertising?
totally agree with
Why
you.
why is the idiot in the commercial who's, hiding in the backyard because it's time for chores And mom and the daughter and the son are out there looking at him holding a rake saying, really, he's still this jerk, or, sorry to be specific, but I'm going to be specific. Everybody loves Raymond, where, yeah, he's a charming guy, but it's like, it doesn't, not overly concerned about his kids. And the mom has to always, be a mom to him, as a stereotype, that is just so old and trite these days, and you and I could talk all night about the syndrome of I know it happened to me, I know it happened to you, where I was a single father, so and from a very early age with my son. So, I traveled with a diaper bag, the way some people travel with a briefcase. I just always had it with me. And I can't tell you how many times, people, usually women, said, well, good for you. You can change a diaper, or good for you. You know how to get him to, to take the bottle or to go
So
take a nap.
condescending.
And
Yeah.
it's like, well, he's my child, I mean, of
Right.
course that, it changes diaper all day long, and no one, of course, would ever do that with a woman. We get that.
No.
But even with younger couples, I see it where it's like it's just assumed a woman has these skills and a man doesn't. And it's like, well, no, that's not the case. And some of them are learned skills. I just had a colleague at work that took paternity leave, which was great. He came back and he was gone for a few weeks. And credit to my company for having the policy in place. It's not mandatory in this country, as we know. And
Right.
I was chatting with him and I said, back in the 90s, I took a week off from work. Now, this was not paternity leave. This was vacation. I used my
You took
vacation time when my
PTO.
son
Yeah.
was born. Yeah. And I not only, got a credit, it was vacation time that I had to use, but I had to, at the magazine I was working at, I had to write stories in advance so they could use them while I was gone. Right.
Right.
So, that was, and it was very rare. And I had both older female and male colleagues at the magazine say to me, you took time off? Why? It was your wife that had the baby. You didn't.
Right.
Why'd you take?
It was
And
your
I said,
wife who had the
that
baby.
was, it was the most magical week of my life. I mean, by far, that was, I spent that week and many, a lot of that time was just hours spent sitting on the bed with, this 7 pound guy where we're just looking at each other,
Right.
and I wouldn't have traded that for any vacation I've ever had and have been all over the world.
And and you're right. It really is so entrenched in our society. And I was telling you, prepping for this podcast, it's this promulgation of send the man to work. The man
Yeah,
is the provider. The Pew Research from 2017. What do we value men for? Integrity and honesty, I think, was the number one. What was number two? He's the provider for the family. And we make the stories that we tell about men through popular culture so oriented towards, not self-actualization. Broadway is filled with shows that are about female empowerment. There's Suffs, there's and Juliet. There's so many wonderful shows, and I'm not knocking them. I'm just
yeah,
saying
yeah,
so much production going on where people leave the theater charged up, feeling good about women pursuing something grand.
right,
Tell me the last musical that was not a comedy, not something that, was not in the same vein as these, that showed a man lifting himself up. When I went to see The Insiders, it was about violence. It was about
yeah,
remorse. It was about, boys struggling to not express themselves in any other way but hostility.
right,
And yes, at the end, there's some redemption that goes on, but people are
right,
dead at the end of that show.
yeah,
And is that really how we want to portray men over and over and over again? And how do we expect boys to aspire to something like and Juliet or the
right,
Barbie movie of,
right,
expanding your horizons? When what do we give them? We give them John Wick, a stoic murderer. We give them, Reacher, who's another stoic
sure,
murderer. These
sure,
are the men symbols we give boys and young men. And then we wonder, why are boys closed off? Why are boys struggling? Why are
Right,
boys,
right,
unexpressive with their? Well,
right,
hello.
right. Or yeah,
What do
absolutely.
we
I mean,
honor about
we
boys?
have we have this, this history that goes back millennia of, men being hunters, gatherers, and warriors. And it's been built into the DNA and it's been built into the culture and the movies and all the rest of it. And, glorifying war, all the rest of it. And then, we wonder why
Yeah.
suddenly in a very different society now, men are struggling and boys are struggling, and
Let's.
I, I had a really interesting conversation with a woman recently, not really a friend, more a colleague from work. And we were talking about some of these issues, and she started off by saying, well, men have been controlling the world for years. I said, yes, I know. I said, but now here we are. I mean, I can't, take blame for things
Can't
that happened
change
before I
that.
was
I can't
born.
rewrite
Right.
history.
And it was awful. And I just did a lecture last week on aviation, and I was celebrating the very brave women who became the first pilots in the aviation industry, and the flight attendants who had to sue and go to the Supreme Court so that they wouldn't get fired because they had turned 30 or had gained
Right.
weight or had gotten pregnant or had gotten married and they got
Right.
fired. That was in their contracts. I mean, I celebrate that. Do you know that the
Right.
first time two females were captain and first officer on a U.S. airline was in 1977, and the airline was Air Illinois. They made history. Now there should
Air
have been champagne.
Illinois.
Yes, a small regional carrier. Yeah, the big guys were nowhere near that state at that point. And although there were some female pilots out there at the time, they ensured that they never flew together, right? And so the
Right.
Air Illinois CEO apparently said, "Oh God, we can't have this." He's ready to cancel the flight rather than that because somebody got sick and they were thrown together. And so they went ahead with the flight, but they were ordered to keep the cockpit door closed. Okay. And don't tell the passengers. Now, this should have been celebrated with champagne and an appearance on Good Morning America at the time, back in 1977. This was an historic moment. Two females for the first time, two women piloted a U.S. airline flight. And instead it was, shh, don't tell anybody, right? So you and I are both, sensitive to this and to those struggles. Now we have, we still have struggles for girls and women. Of course we do. But we also have struggles for boys and men. And to say, to
Sure.
just be flippant about it and then say, oh, well, they're too busy playing video games in the basement, or, oh, well, and so what happened when I was talking to this woman who was a colleague, we were talking about these issues, and I knew she had children and I didn't know the gender. And she said, well, I have, two boys and a girl. And I said, well, you want to see your daughter thrive, right? Of course you do. And she said, yeah. And I said, but don't you want to see your sons thrive too? Like there's a weird disconnect for some people that it's like you're attacking, half the population, an entire gender, but yet you love people in that gender, and so all I was saying was, don't we want all the best for our kids? And it's not a thing where only one side can win and the other side doesn't.
Yeah. It's not a zero sum game. And I remember when Richard Reeves did an interview on a podcast with Ezra Klein, who is a progressive, left leaning New York Times opinion writer and a book author. And I'll never forget when Reeves started talking about the problems boys are having in school, and Ezra kind of reacted with that. Well, and Reeves said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! America pushed through Title IX when we knew that women were struggling.
Right.
Where's the national movement now that it's boys who are struggling? Why is this a difficult conversation when it's the exact same thing?" And
Mhm.
his point should not be lost on American society because we see it as you just stated it. In fact, Reeves, when he tried to publish his book of Boys and Men, he had his agent shopping his book around New York City. And I'm actually reading right now Reeves's own comments from an interview he did back in 2023, leading up to his first book tour for of Boys and Men. And he said, "A number of people warned me against writing a book about boys and men because it's such a fraught subject, particularly in politics right now, and because so many people are afraid that merely drawing attention to the problems of boys and men is implying somehow less effort will be paid to girls and women."
Right.
And in fact, when he took his book to a publisher, who was a friend and was willing to debrief with Reeves afterwards. The publisher said that was the most awkward and difficult book committee presentation in my life. Now, we don't know from that interview just what exactly was said, but I think the implication is, or the inference is, they didn't want to publish a book like Richard Reeves' book. And I think you may have felt a similar pushback when you were shopping around Half a Child.
Yeah, no, I did, and I've spoken about it a little bit over time, but I never really had a chance to sort of give the whole context. So my novel, Half the Child, just to be clear, it's about a child custody and abduction story, and it is and from the perspective, the narrator, the fictional narrator, Michael, is a father of a young boy whose mother abducts him, and Michael basically upends his life. His entire life comes crashing down around him as he puts all of his energy into trying to get his son back. I wrote it in first person and I wrote it in present tense. And as a former creative writing teacher, I can tell you that's kind of statistically those are rare choices. But I wanted to have a sense that you're inside this person's brain. There's no third person omniscient. There's no godlike view. You're inside his brain as he's encountering these things in real time. The analogy I use is a car accident. It's like boom, every time he thinks something's going to get better, boom, it gets worse. And he is treated very poorly by the court system, unfortunately. And more important than that, his child is treated very poorly by the court system. And that's what we forget. We look at everything is a competition in this country. Everything is sports. Everything is a winner or losing. Everything is, George Carlin was brilliant in talking about football as a metaphor for war, and obliterating the enemy, And in this country, people, when you say custody, it's like, well, it's about the parents and who won and who lost. No, it's about the children, and very often the children lose. Okay, so forget about who won on the parent side. And I can say that as a parent, having been through this.
I
And
I can vouch for the same thing. I've been through it
yeah,
myself, 3.5 years.
and
Yep.
so with Half the Child, I decided to write a novel about custody, and I had a terrific agent, a young man at ICM, one of the biggest agencies, and he read it, he loved it, he immediately took me on, and then he wanted some changes as usual, and he said, I suggest you do this and this. I did. Took a few months. I got it back to him. He said, okay, great. And I had already, had my first book published by a big publisher, HarperCollins. And so, I thought, okay, I've been down this road and now here we go. And his enthusiasm made me enthusiastic. So I said, great. And the rejection started, dribbling in, and then they continued dribbling in. So I invented a new term. This is I don't know if it's ever going to make it into dictionary, but it's my invention. This is the book, Half the Child. And as you can see on the back, like every book, it has what are called blurbs or endorsements. These are some terrific writers: Catherine Taylor, Judith Stone, Tom DeHaven, all people that I love as authors. And I invented the term the regerb. That is a blurb that is comes in the form of a rejection. It's a rejection from a publisher, from an editor that is so good you could use it on the back of the book. And so, look, whenever a writer starts talking about being rejected, it's like, oh, here we go, boo-hoo. I've been an author my whole life. I can wallpaper every room in my apartment with rejections. Who hasn't? Whether it's an op-ed or a book, that's a part of life. I used to tell my students, it's like you better get used to rejection because it's coming, no matter who you are. I don't care what your last name is, even if it's Shakespeare, right? And so the rejections started coming in, and it just, normally a standard rejection is something brief and something along the lines of, well, this isn't for us, but we hope it finds a good home, have a nice day. And one of the rejections was 3 pages long. So I started calling all my published author friends, from grad school and from personal life and different people I knew, colleagues that had taught with me, all published authors. And I said, what's the longest rejection you ever got? I don't know, 2 paragraphs. Um, and one woman in particular really struck me because I truly I could pull out 5 things that she said and there would be a great blurb on the back. And she was talking about how she laughed and how she cried and how her husband woke up because she was reading the manuscript in bed, and he said, "Why are you crying, honey?" And she was reading Half the Child, right? And so you read this and you think, oh, great. So when are we publishing it? And then she said, and that's why it's painful for me to have to say that I'm retired. So I said to my agent, look, something's going on here. I'm talking to people that have a lot of experience in publishing, and we're getting rejected, but they seem to like the book. So what's happening? Again, if you're getting those 2 sentence short ones, like, well, good luck with this. Okay, all right. So I said to him, what's happening? And so he finally, started following up with some of the ones that were rejecting it and saying, could you be more specific why you're rejecting it? And now here's where we get into the gender stuff, which was really, it may call me naive, but I never thought I'm writing a book. It's about a man, it's about a father, but it could just as easily be about a woman. I look at it that it's interchangeable because there are enough horror stories from the custody courts that are about men and enough about women.
Absolutely.
And so, the system is broken. It hurts children. It hurts mothers. It hurts fathers. I was in a relationship with a woman who was hurt by the custody courts. Clearly, it's gender neutral in that regard in some ways, unfortunately. But I did not say I'm writing a man's empowerment book. I'm writing a book about father. I wrote a book. Why did I make the protagonist a man? Because as many authors do, I'm a man and I knew I could be more comfortable inside a fictional skin. But
Right.
in the end, we started hearing, when he pushed back, when the agent pushed back, we started hearing, well, first of all, and you get these broad statements that are so broad that they're ridiculous in a country as big as the United States. Men don't buy books and men don't read books. So I'm like, well, okay, stop right there, And then, you dig deeper. It's like, well, women make up the audience of books. And then you hear another, truism that isn't a truism. Women don't buy books about men, and women can't sympathize with a male protagonist. So now let's be really clear. What are the rules on language here? Can I say that the guy who is the narrator
There
of
are
this
no
book?
rules.
Right. Well, Michael Mullen, the narrator of this book, he is not an asshole. Okay. He is, he's going through a painful experience, but his whole life is about his child. He loves his son. He's devoted to him. Nothing is more important to him.
So
He
many
had
tender scenes in the book. So many.
Oh, well, thank you. And then of course there's also work scenes because I had to give him a job. So I made him an air traffic
Yep.
controller at New York's LaGuardia Airport. Nice, quiet job. Um,
Low
and
stress.
right, exactly. Just what you want to do when you're in a court battle. Um, so anyway, I said, well, wait a minute. First of all, I know so many women in my life that I've been in relationships with or sisters. I come from a big family. My mother, female bosses, female friends. I have a lot of platonic female friends. I always have. I've never had a problem with that. I have guy friends that sometimes say to me, what do you mean you're hanging out with her and going to dinner? It's like, yeah, that's what we do. We're friends. Um, and I know that all of them would have wanted to read this book had I not written it. And I also know that a lot of them would have called me and said, hey, I read this book called Half the Child. You should read it, Bill, if I hadn't written it, right? And so I said, and what could I say? I said, well, I think this is wrong. I think women will respond to it. Well, here we are. I had to then make a very tough decision, and I decided to self-publish after, again, my first book had been traditionally published by HarperCollins. And why did I make that decision? Because I called
And
together.
you were a published author already.
Yeah,
Your
yeah.
aviation book came out first.
Yeah, and it did pretty well at HarperCollins. And
Yeah.
I had a 1 month long media tour. I had a public relations person from HarperCollins accompany me twice
You
to
were a
CNN and
known entity.
Fox and all of that.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, well, I've been down this road. Thankfully, I did have that experience because it helped me with the self-publishing to go about it in the
Right.
right way. I
Right.
tried to remember everything that they did for me that I was now doing for myself. I
Right.
don't know that I would have been able to do it had I not had that experience. But
Absolutely.
what I realized is that the when I started doing readings, it was women that were showing up. Now, I do not believe that men don't read books and men don't buy books, but women were responding to this. And so, I've talked about this in a couple of the readings that I've done and some podcasts that I've done on custody shows and things like that, where I have said, if you go, I mean, it's public, so anybody can see it. If you go to Amazon or if you go to Goodreads and you look up Half the Child, I don't know many of the people on there. Some of them I do. Some of them are people I know in my life, but overwhelmingly they're strangers. But I'm taking a guess that, people with names like Linda and Susan and Jennifer are not male, right? And those are the people that are giving it 5 stars and who love it, right? And in the most extreme example, what happened was I had a woman, I have a website, halfthechild.com, very, very easy, no punctuation tricks or anything. Halfthechild, all one word.com. And on there, there's an email set up, where you just contact me. And I check it all the time. I check it every day or every other day. And when the book first came out in particular, I still get mail though from readers. And a woman, uh, I can't say it without laughing. A woman emailed me and said how much she loved the book. And I said, well, that's great. I'm reading this. And then she said, can you tell me something? Michael Mullen, is he single? And I had to break the news to her. Well, it's worse than that. He's fictional. You know, I made him up. He's a fictional character. And she wanted to get in touch with him. That's how, that's how she was touched. So again, the powers that be, I'm sorry to say it, I'm not trying to burn bridges or anything else. They were wrong in saying that, well, these rules, it's like Hollywood, they come up with
Yeah.
rules and the rule sticks until it's proven wrong. And then the opposite rule becomes it, right? Oh, audiences don't like XYZ until a movie becomes a success and it's they do. So to say women wouldn't like books about men, women love reading about a devoted, caring father. And that's what this guy is. And I certainly didn't write it to attract single women to fall in love with him. But it's the natural outgrowth where, I had one woman say to me, forget looks, forget money, forget this, forget that, forget whether it's a dad bod, whatever. There is nothing sexier than a man who's devoted to his children. That just puts an arrow
Absolutely.
through my heart.
I've heard that as well from women. Yes.
So that's, when I read about, others having these experiences trying to get published, I experienced it firsthand. Maybe I was a little naive, as I said. I went into it thinking, oh, this will be, I didn't think it would be easy, but I thought, okay, this book is eventually going to get published. And I had to do it myself. So I still am out there all the time. I'm always happy to do readings, go to bookstores and libraries and book clubs. And it's a labor of love, Half the Child. I'll always be promoting it.
And interestingly enough, Bill and I have been having this conversation off and on for a couple of years now. But back in December of last year, Bill and I were texting each other because a gentleman named David Morris, he teaches creative writing at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Back on December 7th, the New York Times published a guest essay from Mr. Morris. And Morris wrote about where are men in publishing? And he starts off the essay with the fact that in 2004, about half the authors on the New York Times fiction bestseller list were women and about half men, obviously. This year, according to Morris, the list looks to be more than 3/4 women. And when he spoke to Eamon Dolan, a vice president and executive editor at Simon & Schuster, Dolan told him the young male novelist is a rare species. And so, what this says to me is I don't think like all of a sudden since 2004, men have had less to say, that they're less interested in being authors. But as Morris writes in his essay, is that the publishing industry is highly dominated by women. And I would imagine, Bill, you probably sent your book to at least 24 houses.
Yes.
So you've had the experience of at least 24 editors who were assigned your manuscript. I would imagine 90% of them were probably women.
Yeah, I can't give you the number off the top of my head, but if I went in, I think you're in the right ballpark, probably 80 or 90%. And, there are other factors too, because this is a book that perhaps someone in their 20s may not relate to too well if you haven't had children. I don't say that easily because I know I have many people in my life who are not parents, but they understand parenthood and they're great aunts and they're great uncles and they're great, caregivers of children in their lives. So I've never been one to say like, well, unless you've had a kid, you don't understand. No, that's not the case. But I will say at a certain age, you don't think of these things. I always think back to this. The movie Mrs. Doubtfire with Robin Williams that a lot of people remember, it was labeled a comedy. To me, it's a tragedy. It's not at all a comedy. And it came out just before I became a parent. And I remember going to see it and thinking like, oh, that was fun. And oh, Robin Williams is funny as always. And that was it. And then I saw it again years later and I said, oh my God, this is horrific. This is a story of a man with a broken heart because he cannot spend time with the children that he loves. What
Yeah.
the hell is funny about that? That is not a comedy. Okay, it was marketed as a comedy, obviously, and Robin Williams was brilliant, obviously, but he was not Don Draper. He was not like, well, I'll see them on, every other weekend or whatever. No, he wanted to be with them every minute. When you and I were commenting on that essay, not a word there from that author surprised me. Having been down this road, and I'm sure it didn't surprise you either. And when I
Hmm.
went and I recently reviewed those rejections that I was talking about, the regerbs, several of the editors self-volunteered, said, well, I'm not a parent yet. I'd like to be, but this makes me uncomfortable. And one, I'll just come right out and say it. One of the editors said, it was one of the few male editors, he said, I just became a father recently. I have a newborn at home. He said, there's no way I can spend a year working on a novel about a child taken away from a parent. Now, he was honest about it, and I give him credit for that. I also would argue if I had met him, this is all through my agent, I would have said to him, that means you can't, I mean, who's going to publish books about the tragedies in our lives? I mean, if you had,
Yeah.
I mean, what if you had a novelist writing about, losing a limb in Iraq? What if you had a novelist writing about, some other horrific thing? I mean, embrace it, don't run away from it. But I get it, I get it. But still, that's what I was encountering. So I remember saying to my agent, like, maybe it would be helpful, not even gender, but just maybe someone with a little bit more life experience that understands these bonds better. Not because they've had children or haven't, but because they're older and understand it. When I look, here's another one. I have it in the book, and a close friend and I, my friend Andy, we always talk about it. When I saw the movie Close Encounters back as a teenager or whatever in the 70s.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
again, I absorbed it as a teenager would. Now I look at it and I'm like, wait a minute, Richard Dreyfuss, dude, you're gonna get on a spaceship. I understand you're leaving your wife. You're both adults. You're gonna leave your kids? Like to me, it's like, no, that's not an option. I
Right.
don't care what the offer is. And guess what? An amazing thing happened. About 10 years ago, I'm reading an article by Steven or an interview with Steven Spielberg. And Spielberg, he was asked about like, what would you do differently? And what about your career and all of this, and this, legendary director. And he said, and he brought up that exact issue. I almost fell off the chair when I was reading it. He said, well, I look back at Close Encounters and I wasn't a parent at the time. And I think, like, how did I do that movie where a guy leaves his family? His wife was Terry Garr, I think, if I'm not
He
mistaken.
was. Yep.
And that in itself is pretty hard because I love Terry Garr and I can't imagine leaving her behind and me getting on a spaceship. But as a father, leaving your kids behind to get on a spaceship
Right.
or to do anything? No, not an option.
What you're seeing there is the net effect of both, decades of men being told what a man is, what he should prioritize, but also this mythopoetic approach to men that the love and nurture of these human beings that you helped conceive is somehow pushed down below something more lofty that makes you a man. A lot of people say to me, well, don't point the finger so much at culture, at pop culture, whether it's movies or television or whatever. And I say, no, they're actually integrated. The reason why you see so few sensitive, male, nurturing dads on television and in the movies, the reason why you see so few uplifting male shows on Broadway, akin to and Juliet, is that society doesn't isn't comfortable with us being those men. The insiders. It had to be that dual edge
Yeah.
of the injured ego, the truly sensitive, but how does that person's character portray itself through the bulk of it? Through hostility and violence and stoicism and rejecting nurture. And so culture kind of goes hand in hand. And in fact, the whole reason why I even started Mindful Masculinity was because a very lovely friend of mine sent me an essay by a professor up in Canada, and it was published online. And the question that this individual was trying to answer was, why don't more men write divorce memoirs? We have so many women divorced memoirs. Where's the movies about guys who got betrayed by their wife and fell into the depths of despair and rallied for himself and for his family? Where are those? If you don't have those, what is that saying about society? And what is that saying about how we will break this cycle?
Right,
And to know that the publishing industry didn't want to break the cycle with you, that's what we need,
right,
because this isn't working.
right.
Men go through divorce. Do they not rise up again? Do they all just fall into despair? Do they just get married to the second wife because they don't know how to take care of themselves? What is the story? We never explore that and give voice to men. If men can't hear other men's voices, then yeah, what's the model for them?
Yes,
Women have a
absolutely.
model. Pop culture gives them the model. I
Right.
can't tell you, when I left SUFs, the the excitement in the women, because it was, I would say, 80 to 85% women in the audience. Um, you could see that for them, this was an emotionally uplifting experience. And that's a good thing.
Right.
Where are the emotionally uplifting male experiences?
Well, from your lips, anybody out in Hollywood that's looking to buy the rights,
Book rights to Half the
nephew.com.
Child.
Okay, that was I mean that was particularly shameless, and I'm known to be shameless.
Don't be as
Um,
shameless as you want. You deserve it.
thank you. But you know, you're right. And one of the things that struck me was I wrote an essay years ago in the Washington Post about male how males are portrayed. And what I focused on was not movies or TV or books. I focused on advertising because I think it's sort of the we don't realize it's below the surface in a way. When we talk about, images, we talk about, higher art than advertising. But in many ways, I think it's the most powerful and the most pervasive, right? And there's been a transformation. Just look at, TV commercials. In the last 10 years or so, for the good, there's been a transformation in showing more empowered women, more people of color, more ethnicity of every stripe, more mixed marriages, right? I was on a racist page on Facebook recently, and this guy's an out and out racist, and he was complaining about every time he turns on TV, he sees a mixed race couple, and where are all the white couples, and where are the black couples, and where when people used to stay to their own, okay? But
You really
underneath,
can't see the white couple
yeah,
commercials.
yeah,
Jeez.
well, underneath his hatred, his point was taken that Madison Avenue has adapted in that way, except
Oh, God.
except we still have the jerk father, right? We still have the
Yeah.
father who's disconnected, and the kids and the mothers are always smarter and always have to put him on the right track because he's a
Yeah.
moron, he's lazy, he's drinking a beer, he's watching TV, whatever. Ironically, watching TV. This is the very medium that's trying to sell you a product through that commercial, right? But that's we're talking that's a very pervasive thing. And
Yeah.
so, you know, I don't think you or I had any intention to take a deep dive into politics when we talked about doing this, but it's worth noting that for those of us who are quite upset with the state of our country right now, um, that was due in part to the fact that the Democratic Party has not made an effort in over 50 years to appeal to men. If you don't appeal to certain demographics in politics or in anything, in branding, in advertising for products, what happens? They go somewhere else, right? Well, you know, I'm not making any excuses for how people vote, but it's like it's the inevitable outcome. If you if you want to sit here and say we don't have a man crisis, we don't have a boy crisis, they've been in power so long, they're so entrenched in power, they don't even realize, and they're just reacting to others, finally getting a fair shake. In literature, I love it that women are more represented and that we're hearing voices we never heard from ethnicities and races that traditionally had trouble getting published. But again, it's not a seesaw. There's room for everybody. Let's make the bookshelf bigger so everybody can have a voice out there. And instead, and it's the same with politics, you know. And so if somebody comes along and says, "Oh, I feel your pain," people wind up voting for them.
That what we're trying to do here, is, at the very least, what you and I are trying to do with mindful masculinity, is say if men have more opportunity, if men have a broader array of jobs that are considered non-gender based. I mean, one of the things Richard Reeves is pushing for is more male teachers in kindergarten, in elementary school, in middle school, those early ages, so boys can see a positive male role model 5 days a week when they go to school. Perhaps somebody who's nurturing them along in their education. He's like, we need to do this. And I just wonder, how would women react if all of a sudden, men started populating school buildings at the percentage that women do today? We have these implicit biases. Someone's going to lose something
Right.
if we put more effort into boys and men. And as Richard Reeves has tried to say a million times in the last 2 years since he published his book, maybe not as eloquently as you just said, all respect to Richard Reeves, but we're lifting the tide for everybody. That woman who voted against a woman is only looking for all tides to lift, because
Right.
if her husband's tide does not lift, she suffers, her children suffer. This is about a very objective concept. It is not about gender specifically, it is about human flourishing. And if we can't change the dialogue away from that, then this is going to be a really hard battle.
No question about it. Yeah. And for me, the irony, I love the term mindful masculinity because you're telling men to embrace certain aspects of them, the good aspects, not the bad. And, I look back on my own life and I've been in some very high testosterone environments over the years. I worked in airline operations, which was almost exclusively male. And the few females that were there were not treated well and were abused in many cases, certainly verbally. And I was in the Air Force Auxiliary for several years, same thing. And, I'm a boxer and I've been in a lot of boxing gyms. And then when I lived in Connecticut a few years ago, I found a great boxing gym, and guess what? It was run by a woman. She was terrific. She was a former boxer herself, Golden Gloves and all the rest. I said to her one day, how many other women in the state of Connecticut own a boxing gym? And she said, to my knowledge, I'm the only one. And I said, think about that. I said, you're a real pioneer. And she was just having none of it. She was like, shut up. She didn't want to hear it. And I said, no, really. I said, you're a feminist icon. She said, what do you mean by that? And I said, I'm complimenting you. And she said, nah, don't bother complimenting me. She just went out and did it. Now think of the courage that it took and you talk about high testosterone. It doesn't get much more high testosterone than owning a boxing gym. Okay. And I look back on that and I think, yeah, okay, so I've been in these environments and I grew up in time and place in Queens, New York, where, boys were boys and girls were girls and there were unwritten rules. And you never saw a boy pushing a baby carriage down the street or, playing with dolls unless they were G.I. Joes, because then you could mask them, right? Now they're violent dolls, right? So, they're holding an M16, so that's different. But I look back on it and I think, I never really understood my own masculinity until I started carrying my son around as a baby. And I started, strapped him into the stroller and got on the subway and, took him off for the day for wherever we were going and all of that. And, until I sang him to sleep at night and until I read to him and all the rest of it. I had no clue what masculinity was until then. And I think, why is this a message that in this time, in 2025, that should not be a controversial message, and that should not be a message that's, poo-pooed or dismissed. And, again, like let's lift all the boats at once, not just some.
The only way we're going to end this, because it's this push and pull, the seesaw as you describe it. Women start getting more rights in the 60s and 70s. You get the male liberation movement, which had some element of progressiveness, but also we saw a backlash. Into the 80s and 90s, women are occupying more places in the workplace. We saw the rise of the promise keepers and an evangelical masculinity. It's like a sine curve, and it just keeps going like this. And it's because we're always pitting each other against each other instead of, the all, the rising tide lifts all boats. And until we change the dialogue to that, I just don't see how this ends, because each tribe, or a large enough portion of each tribe, will retreat to their corner in the boxing ring
Right.
and come out, with fisticuffs instead of,
Yeah.
well, I don't want to fight that person. That
No.
person, is so and so's boss. And I'm
Right.
glad that she's a boss because she's earning a great salary for her family, and she's mentoring both men and women. And she's got a really great attitude about, how she does that to lift the next generation. I mean, what does it matter what gender that person is? And I don't know any other way to stop this cycle except to point it back to, well, what are the results? The results are a company that does really well, a company that takes care of its employees, a society with happy people. I don't know. That sounds pretty good to me. I don't need
Mhm.
to swing my dick around to
Right.
to
Right.
see that that's not a really great thing.
Yeah.
We just got to change the dialogue.
Yeah. No question about it. But I think in a lot of ways, Rich, that's exactly what you're doing. And I can't even
I'm trying.
put into words how much respect I have for you and affection for what you're doing, because I know that right out of the gate, there are certain people that are going to dismiss you, and certain
Oh
people on
yes,
both sides of the
on
gender
both
thing,
sides. Yeah.
and are going to, attack you, and are going to roll, or worse than being attacked sometimes is a very quiet eye roll, I have found, like,
Oh, I've
oh,
gotten those. Yep.
and that could be worse than somebody coming out, swinging and attacking you outright, just like, oh, sure, yeah, masculinity, yeah, um, why can't we say we've got a lot of problems right now? We all know that we have an awful problem in this country with toxic masculinity, but
Absolutely.
the word toxic can be removed from that, and masculinity in and of itself is
Right.
not is not problematic.
It's
Okay, it's
not
how it's
innately
channeled.
toxic. Yes.
Right. So for too many people, the word masculinity just goes hand in hand with toxic, and there's no other kind. And well, that's obviously false. And so that's the real messaging here, is to say,
Yeah.
you know, there are some inherent differences, and we embrace them many ways. We embrace them
Yeah.
in the bedroom. We embrace them in marriages, in relationships, in all kinds of places. We
Right.
embrace those differences. We celebrate them. Why can't we embrace them publicly and say, yeah, it's all about opportunity. If you're equipped, to be a firefighter or to be a pilot or be whatever it is, then yeah, let's get the opportunity before you so you can, pursue your dreams. But to say that, well, one side was in charge for so long, so now we're kicking them to the curb. It would be bad enough if it was just guys, our age that were being kicked to the curb, but there are little boys coming up, and that's what I think about all the time.
Masculinity can take so many forms,
Yeah.
and just giving people, the opportunity to go be whatever form defines masculinity for them without causing harm to another person, obviously. Why can't we have that potential?
Right,
Why can't that be the
right.
definition of masculinity?
And it is a very worthy goal. And I think we're in a period of real flux here right now in this country.
Yeah.
I can't, like I said, I can't speak to, I mean, I've traveled a lot, but I can't really speak to the cultures of other countries, not having lived there. And for us right now, these are fundamental questions, because we have to get this, because the effects are so far reaching in terms of the workplace and labor and politics and who's in the White House and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
We're peeling off away from each other. We have more division now than we did 50 years ago. I mean, when you look at it, it's just, and that's frightening, because
Very frightening.
you by not trying to appeal to everyone, putting up walls and dividing people, you open the door for despots to come in and fill the void. And there we are. Yeah.
Here we are.
I won't mention any names, but let's take some
No, you
business.
don't have to. Bill, thank you so much for joining me on this inaugural discussion about men and masculinity. One last time, where can people find you online and where can they purchase your novel, Half the Child?
Sure. I think the easiest way is to just go to the website, halfthechild, all one word.com. On there, there are links that can take you there various places online. The book is available in print and in Kindle form if you like ebooks or audio as well. I'm happy to say, and the
Yeah.
audio speaker was a terrific speech teacher from Queens, New York, like me and like the fictional narrator. He's got a great Queens accent, and he did a great job with the audiobook. If you know, I'm not an audiobook person myself too much, but I love how it came out. So you can go on there, and if you want to contact me, good or bad or whatever, there's an email function right on there. But I
On
got
the
to tell
website.
you, I'm so happy to be here, and I think the world of you, my friend. I really
Thank you.
do.
I
I
think the
just
world of you too.
I
I
treasure
I
our
think
friendship.
I think the career that you've carved out for yourself, the way you mentor other writers so that they can fulfill their potential, has just been a marvelous example.
Appreciate it. So
Yep.
look, the fight continues, and let's keep it up. I'm gonna be watching all that you do in this space because I hope that you're gonna bring more people
Well,
into
you're going to come back for at least a couple more discussions. I'm not going to let you off the hook.
Absolutely. Did I mention it?
Okay.
Oh, I did. Okay, good. I thought we forgot that. Absolutely. Anytime.
Bill, thank you so much.
Okay, good. If let's speaking of masculinity, if we weren't
Yes.
doing by Zoom right now, I'd give you a big hug and not be at
And
all
I would
ashamed.
gladly accept it.
I know you would.
Okay.
We'll put that on ice.
Take care, my friend.
You too. Thanks, Rich.